All right, so next up is Jesse Noby, who is a senior technology lead with Tegrita. And Jesse's going to cover how to leverage dynamic content in emails and landing pages.
Hey everybody. Thanks for taking the time out of your day to learn a little bit about dynamic content. So it's just a quick overview of all the points I'm going to hit here. Um, so, hopefully by the end of my little presentation, you guys have some ideas about how you could start using this, especially in emails. Let's go to the next slide. So there are a number of different approaches to doing personalization in Eloqua, and I think we're all really familiar with field merges. I mean, that one's very straightforward. We're just pulling some information, usually off of the Eloqua contact, and putting into an email. Um, and I think we said this before in this user group, but that's just kind of like table stakes, putting a first name in email is almost expected nowadays. So we're going to want to move a little bit beyond that into dynamic content, where you'll be able to actually swap in different pieces of content that are more relevant to your audience. But I also want to bring in this idea of using filter decisions within your campaign canvases to split up that group and send them in different directions. And so you could really get creative with these three different things. So let's go to the next slide. So, you may be asking yourselves like, well, we do this or we do that. What's the best way to attack this? So, um, if there's going to be a lot of different things that you want to show to different groups of people, then dynamic content is probably going to be a good fit for you. Um, if there's not a lot of variation, then you may want to focus your energy on just creating totally different emails and then doing that filter decision routing to send them to the right email. So, you know, touch 1A or touch 1B, that's just an easier way of looking at it, right? But you could also use a mix of these strategies. So you could pepper in a little bit of dynamic content, but still have it split across multiple emails. So what I like to do with this is whenever somebody comes to me and says, "Hey, we want to add some dynamism to our emails. What's the best way?" Just look at the amount of work really that's going to be involved in this because if you need to make 100 different emails and you're just copying emails and changing some content in them, maybe dynamic content is the better way to go. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So, how does dynamic content work? Well, it's actually a really simple concept, and I'll actually jump in Eloqua in a little bit to show you guys a simple example. But it's just a set of rules. So you create the logic behind those rules, a lot like you would do in a segment or in just a shared filter in Eloqua, using and and or logic and you can use a lot of different objects, fields in your dynamic content. But most of the time, it's going to be contact based because that's a lot of what you're doing in Eloqua. And then with dynamic content, there's always a default rule as well. So you have kind of like a fallback to say, well, nobody met the the different criteria that I was making, so we wanted to make sure that they see something or nothing, basically. And then yeah, sorry, the next point there was that it used to be that there was no good reporting around dynamic content, and that really actually made the decision for us a lot of the time in terms of what we were going to do. And so uh, people were more reluctant to use it just because they wouldn't know. So now we've got a couple of insight reports or OBIE reports that can give you some more details about how things are doing. And just in general, it's another uh, method for you to better target your contacts and give them that more relevant uh, piece of information that they may care about. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So let's talk about a few sample use cases. This first one is just season ticket members, right? And a few other cohorts. But you may have your first time season ticket purchasers and your long time season ticket purchasers. And I'm sure you guys have a wealth of data for that sort of thing. Um, so you may want to say, hey, this is your first time being a season ticket member. Did you know about all these great features that we have with that package? Whereas the people that have been long time season ticket members, it's all kind of um, water under the bridge. They know all that stuff. So you want to make their experience as smooth as possible. You may want to talk to them a little bit differently. Um, but just some other groups that I thought of as I was putting this together. Families with young children versus like a corporate buyer who has a box or something like that, or people with disabilities who need to know about the accessibility of the stadium. So those are all great ways to kind of slice and dice things. Those would all turn into rule sets in your dynamic content. So then, if you're sending out a welcome email at the beginning of the season, you could have a piece of dynamic content that just automatically flips between those groups and shows them a little piece of content. Let's go to the next one. Yeah, another thing is that, depending on how you're using Eloqua, you may have this relationship with the stadium and you want to notify your database about events that are also happening at the stadium. So it's another opportunity for you to maybe insert that as a little um call out in your main subject email. Maybe you're giving an update about the team, but you want to let people know that there's an upcoming concert or something like that. Let's go to the next one. And another one that I've kind of picked up on talking to various different teams is player preference. Some people, especially certain teams, really like to follow their favorite player, and we pull that data in. So if you want to keep people updated about those different players, then this is kind of an easier way, I think, to manage that or to add it as a little bonus add-on to your content. Um, and that's just a really simple set of rules, depending on how many players you have on the team. You just have a rule for each one of those players and put a little blurb update into the content section to throw in your email. Let's go to the next slide here. Oh, one more. Yeah, sponsors, of course. So kind of going back to what Brandy was saying, um, this is another opportunity for you to do some simple insertion of sponsorship messages or CTAs that you could do rule sets around different sponsors and then use your criteria to look at the information you have about your contacts to send them the right piece of information. So in our example here, millennials versus boomers. I know some teams you're already collecting that birthday information, so that's something you can play around with dates, right? Okay, cool. Let's go to the next slide, and I think we're moving into my example here, the Tegrita Strike Force bowling team profiles. So I'll take over sharing my screen. And I just want to show you all some simple dynamic content and just get your wheels spinning in terms of how you could start to use this. And even before I go into my example, one thing I wanted to say is that this doesn't have to be really complex. Um, Another way that you can look at doing this is just enhancing the emails that you're already sending and putting in just little bits of extra special information for people. So what I've done here is I used the new responsive email editor to create our Strike Force newsletter, just letting people know that the new season's about to begin. We've got some static content in here, and then we also have our dynamic content. So this banner image is static. It can very easily be dynamic too. So maybe that's an opportunity for you to put a little sponsorship message in here, and just have the same image, but with slightly different content. This headline, static, the image and this little piece of copy here, static. But down here, I've started to put in my dynamic content. And the nice thing about this editor is that it will show you the different states of each piece of dynamic content. So what it's telling me right now is that there's nothing to see here because we're looking at the default rule. So I can click on this and then I can start to cycle through each piece of content to see what we've got. So I just have a couple of different ones here. And what I've done is I split up my dynamic content here into its own pieces, right? So you don't have to do it that way. You could certainly put this all together into one piece of dynamic content. But the reason why I really did this is because I'm doing this in the responsive editor. It's just a lot easier. Um, it's gonna work well with the responsiveness of the email, as opposed to me having to roll up my sleeves and write some HTML that may or may not work well when it's inserted there. And then it's just a lot easier to think about and compartmentalize those things, I think. So now that I've got this little preview, like that's all well and good, but you can also go up here into actions and go to preview and see what this is going to look like for a given contact. So we'll look at my contact and we get a little preview of the email here. So this is something that I think it's just good for a sanity check before you send out an email, to try with some real contacts and see what they're going to see. That way you can be a lot more confident. Okay, so you can see that were I to receive this email, I'm going to get some information about myself. And before I move over into showing you guys how I put together the dynamic content, I also wanted to show you this little bonus piece. So over here on the left, we've got all of our different pieces of content and layouts and everything where we can pull this into our email. But if I go over to the gear, this is where the settings now live. You can see that I actually put some dynamic content into the subject line. So this subject line will, for anyone who doesn't qualify for our dynamic content, they'll just get this piece. But then if there are certain player preferences, they'll get a little bit of extra info to, you know, get them to click through and read the email. And you can use this in the preview text as well. I just didn't do that here. Okay, so let's jump over to our examples. And so here you can see I just split this up into four different pieces. Again, you could do this in one if you wanted to. Um, of course, you'd have to do the subject line separately, but for the most part, you could combine them. And also, before I even dive in, this is under the assets menu. Go to components, then dynamic content, and then once you're in here, it's over here on the left. So the way that I tackled this was I just made one of these and then I copied it and renamed it and just replaced the content. It made things a little bit easier, especially if you're doing a lot of rules and a lot of criteria. You don't want to have to go through and redo that a bunch of times, I'm sure. So that's just a way to kind of speed things up. So we'll look at the headline. And what you're seeing here in my dynamic content, as I said, I don't want to show anybody anything if they don't qualify for this. So when those people get the email, they're not even going to know that that was something they could have gotten. But in other use cases, you may want to put just a more generic thing in here, generic call to action, something like that. Um, so, you know, you're still giving them something. Then for Brandy, I just name my rules, around the goal that I'm trying to achieve. So it just makes sense to give our names here. And I have a field in the contact record called player preference. And if we double click on that, then I just used our selection criteria of exactly Brandy Star. Um, you have some other options in here, and this will change depending on the field data type and what you can do with that. And you also have this little not selector. Um, but I really want to keep this as simple as possible, right? The more complex you make your logic, and this is true of anything, the less likely somebody's going to qualify for it. So the simpler the better. But then also, it's a lot easier for you to identify issues and fix them because there's just less for you to have to look and think through. And if I go to a little plus icon down here, you can see that since this is our sandbox, we have access to all of these different entities. You may just have contact fields and account fields, maybe custom object fields. A lot of you may not have events because it's an extra module. It depends on the trim you have. But for the most part, you're really, I think, going to be using contact fields. But you could certainly mix and match these and come up with a lot of really interesting sets of criteria. So I'll just quickly show you here. If I add another contact field, I can toggle this between and or, and I can highlight these and group them and get really a lot more complex with this. And if you've grouped something, you can pull this out, ungroup, or just, move other criteria in there if you want. Um, Let's do that again so you can see that. And if something is grouped, I can ungroup it just by highlighting that right there. And just one more thing with this. If you're editing your content, you have the simple editor, but if you click full, it'll take you to this one that gives you a little bit more leeway in terms of what you're doing. You may be familiar with this from creating headers and footers and shared content. So you can actually use field merges in here as well. So that's another way that you can kind of combine these different types of personalization. Got a little URL link editor as well. And then you can even drill into the source code and write your own HTML or play around with the HTML in here. Right? And so then as we toggle through here, you can see just all our different rule sets, a little preview of those. And I just want to give you guys a quick look at the other ones. You can see it's the same rule set, but all I did was put some copy in here. And I didn't get too crazy with styling it either, but you could, if you wanted to, play around with that. And then our image is simply just that. It's just an image. And I centered them, so that they would look a little bit nicer in the email instead of left aligned. All right, so I think that's everything I wanted to cover with this. Um, again, you guys get creative with this. You could really go pretty deep with it and do a lot of different things, or you could just start putting in one little piece of dynamic content at a time to get a better feel for it. And also definitely mix and match those things. So, and before I end, does anyone have any questions about this? I see I've got one. Any issues with dynamic content not being responsive in the new editor? Yeah, so this is kind of one of the reasons why I split this up so that it would be more, more amenable to the responsiveness. Another thing that I've done, which is probably, a little advanced for some people, is I will send myself a test email to our email and asset account, and from there you can actually see the HTML. You can pull that out. So like, there's no way to get the HTML from this directly from Eloqua. So if I send myself a test, I can see the code that they use to build it, and then I can pull that out and use that as a shell in my dynamic content. So then it will, it will be responsive. But you really need to be careful doing something like that. Obviously, do a lot of testing to be sure that it's going to work properly. But that's one way that I've approached kind of getting around that.